Hello guys, I created this video to be able to impart to you the topics I was not able to discuss personally. I tried to make this as comprehensive as possible, but if you're curious or would want to know more, you can search more about them. If there are some mistakes in terms of chronology, I apologize, as I was not able to rectify them due to time constraints. I hope you will enjoy watching this video and be able to use the information herein in your future subjects as well. Let's start with the definition of concepts. Okay, cognitive means relating to the mental processes involved in knowing, learning, and understanding things. Psychology, of course, is the scientific study of the human mind and its functions, especially those affecting behavior in a given context. And so, cognitive psychology is defined as the scientific investigation of human cognition, perceiving, learning, remembering, thinking, reasoning, and understanding. At the beginning of the 21st century, cognitive psychology has become a broad field concerned with memory, perception, attention, pattern recognition, consciousness, neuroscience, representation of knowledge, cognitive development, language, thinking, and human and artificial intelligence. As you can see, cognitive psychology deals with all of these aspects, but these leaps and bounds would not be possible without their antecedents. Contemplation about the source of knowledge, how people think, solve problems, and perceive the world is as old as human history. The history of cognitive psychology can be parsed into four periods. Okay, the first one is philosophical, then experimental, the third is cognitive revolution, and the modern cognitive psychology. The philosophical period is often counted from the time of the three great philosophers in the 4th to the 5th century BC. However, hieroglyphics suggest that ancient Egyptians were already concerned with mind processes. And for them, great energy was directed towards preserving the soul, but also some theorized that knowledge was localized in the heart. Okay, this rudimentary theorizing could be the basis of the current models of cognition. Greek philosophers were obsessed with knowledge and began to consider questions about perception, memory, and thought. The influential figures in this era are Plato and Aristotle, the teacher and the student. Plato is considered a rationalist who believed that knowledge can only be found through the mind rather than through the corporeal world of the body. Okay. He postulated that the brain was a true locus of knowledge, and he believed in nativism, which is the idea that knowledge is innate or that humans are born with all the knowledge that they need. On the other hand, Aristotle was an empiricist. He believed that all knowledge is gained through experience. He wrote the Anima in 550 BC, where his discussion centered on the kinds of souls possessed by different kinds of living things, distinguished by their different operations. Looking at this diagram, okay, plants have vegetative soul, used for reproduction and growth. Animals have a sensitive soul, okay, for mobility and sensation, and humans have rational soul for thinking and logic. Aristotle supposes that it is our very nature to desire knowledge and understanding. He says that just as having of sensory faculties is essential to being an animal, so the having of a mind is essential to being a human. It means that what is important for animals are sensory faculties to feed and protect themselves, and what is important for humans is having a mind or seat of knowledge to understand the world. However, humans do more than understand. It is equally essential to the human being to plan and deliberate, to ponder alternatives and strategize, and generally to chart courses of action. These actions or activities distinguishes the practical mind from the theoretical mind. Okay. Uh, Aristotle also devoted a great deal of attention to perception, both the general faculty and the individual senses. He treated perception as a case of interaction between two suitable agents, objects capable of action and objects capable of being affected by the action. Okay, if you want to know more, you can read more on the Stanford site with the link I provided. Perception is at number 6. After the era of the three great philosophers, Renaissance period is the next focal point. You may be wondering what happened in between the era of the great Greek philosophy and the Renaissance, so I put the link below for the timeline of Western philosophy, and you can check that out. Okay, so Renaissance is in between 16th to 18th century. It is a period in history where reason was celebrated and advanced over metaphysics and mysticism. Okay, interest in philosophy and other fields of knowledge reinvigorated after the fall of the Roman Empire. And scholars considered thinking, logic, and the nature of the soul. They also believed that the locus of knowledge and rationality was in the brain. And influential figures in this period are René Descartes and Immanuel Kant. René Descartes posited that humans are born with innate ideas, okay, which came from Plato, and forwarded the idea of mind-body dualism, which would come to be known as substance dualism, or the idea that the mind and body are separate substances. Okay, from his time and into the 18th century, major philosophical debates over the source of knowledge took place between the empiricists such as George Berkeley and John Locke, and nativists such as Immanuel Kant. Now, Immanuel Kant had interest in synthesizing these two schools of thought, the nativism and empiricism, and merging of rationalism and empiricism was one of his greatest contributions. Okay. His idea was that mental operations lack substance, only a time dimension, and therefore cannot be assessed. And because of his authoritative opinion, the development of psychology as an experimental science was delayed. In the early experimental period, scientists started to investigate the human mind in a scientific way in the 19th century. Okay, Wilhelm Wundt and Gustav Fechner started to study relations between a person's internal experiences with the world surrounding him or her. Seeing is no longer believing because that what is seen is different from what is. Okay, the first figure in experimental psychology is Gustav Fechner. He was a German physicist, philosopher, and a pioneer in experimental psychology. He lived from 19 April 1801 to 18 November 1887. He was the first person to discover the differences in the insensitivity of a person's senses towards two slightly different stimuli. He is also credited with demonstrating the nonlinear relationship between psychological sensation and physical intensity of a stimulus, which became known as the Weber-Fechner law. His clearest contribution was the demonstration that because the mind was susceptible to measurement and mathematical treatment, psychology had the potential to become a quantified science. Now he got sick, and while lying in bed, Fechner had an insight into the relationship between mental sensations and material sensations. This insight proved to be significant in the development of psychology, as there was now a quantitative relationship between the mental and the physical worlds. The next figure is Hermann von Helmholtz. He was a German physicist and physician. Okay, and he, along with Wundt and Fechner, is recognized as one of the founders of experimental psychology, and it can be seen from his mathematics or computation concerning the eye, theories of vision, ideas on the visual perception of space, color vision research, the sensation of tone, and perception of sound. He is also credited with the invention of unconscious inference or occlusion. In psychology, it means that some of our perceptions are the result of unconscious assumptions we make about the environment. Okay, in memory research, occlusion is the phenomenon of items associated to same cue as a target blocking the successful retrieval of that target through strength-dependent response computation. Okay, the tip of the tongue phenomenon is an example of occlusion. And if you want to know more about that, I put the link below, but then you can also check out other references. Okay, an important implication of Helmholtz's work was that there is a psychological reality and a physical reality, and that the two are not identical. The third figure is Hermann Ebbinghaus. He was a German psychologist who lived from 21 January 1850 to 26 February 1909. Okay, he pioneered the experimental study of memory, discovered the forgetting curve, the learning curve, and the spacing effect. He was determined to show that higher mental processes could actually be studied using experimentation, which was in opposition to the popularly held thought of that time. In his experiment of memory, he first made a set of 2,300 letters, three-letter syllables to measure mental association that helped him find that memory is orderly. Okay, and in 1885, he published his groundbreaking Gedächtnis, later translated to English as Memory, a contribution to experimental psychology. Okay, and his second and most arguably famous finding was the forgetting curve. Okay, and here it shows that the forgetting curve describes the exponential loss of information that one has learned. Okay, the sharpest decline occurs in the first 20 minutes, and the decay is significant through the first hour. The curve levels off after about 1 day, and Hermann Ebbinghaus made several findings that are still relevant and supported to this day. The mid to late 19th century was a critical time in the development of psychology as a scientific discipline, with two discoveries that would later play substantial roles in cognitive psychology. First was the discovery of the Broca's area by Paul Broca. He was a French physician, anatomist, and anthropologist, and he found that a region of the frontal lobe was largely responsible for language production, and that brains of patients with aphasia contain lesions in a particular part of the cortex in the left frontal region, and that was named after him. Okay, so this was the first anatomical proof of localization of brain function. The next important discovery was made by Carl Wernicke. Okay, he was a German physicist, anatomist, psychiatrist, and neuropathologist. Okay, he found that one of two areas in the brain manages speech, and this was named after him, the Wernicke's area, okay, which was responsible for the comprehension of written and spoken language. And damage to this area results in fluent but receptive aphasia. Now, Wernicke's aphasia or receptive aphasia is when someone is able to speak well and use long sentences, but what they say may not make sense. Now, they may not know what they're saying is wrong, so they may get frustrated when people don't understand them. The next figure is one of the most, if not the most prominent figure in cognitive psychology, Wilhelm Wundt. Okay, he was a central figure in German culture between the second half of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Okay, he was a German physiologist, philosopher, psychologist, and professor, known today and for posterity as the father of modern psychology. Okay, coming from a medical and neurophysiological background with a PhD in medicine, he shifted his interest toward psychological and philosophical questions, becoming full professor of philosophy, first at the University of Zurich in 1874, then at the University of Leipzig in 1875. In 1879, he opened the Institute for Experimental Psychology at the University of Leipzig. Okay, the institution was very forward-thinking for its time. Within months, students interested in psychology began seeking out opportunities at the institution. Okay, most of these students were from Germany, but Britain and the United States were also represented. Okay, so Wundt was very passionate about separating science from philosophy and believed that the mind's workings could be observed through scientific experiments and analysis using object control and measurements. By opening the first laboratory in Leipzig, Wundt created the first international training center for psychologists, attracting to Leipzig students from all over the world. Okay, during his academic career, Wundt trained 186 students, graduate students, and 116 are in psychology. Now, his impact upon the development of scientific psychology in many countries, not least in the United States, where his former students founded psychological laboratories inspired by the Leipzig model, is very significant. Okay, it helped disseminate his work, and parts of his theory were developed and promoted by his one-time student, Edward Titchener, who described his system as structuralism. Okay, now structuralism is the analysis of the basic elements that constitute the mind. Okay, we can read more about this topic if you're interested. Okay, so now um, Wundt argued that conscious mental states could be studied using introspection, and he concentrated on the three areas of mental functioning: thoughts, images, and feelings. Wundt believed in reductionism, where consciousness could be broken down or reduced to its basic elements. His introspection was a highly practiced form of self-examination. He trained students of psychology to make observations that were biased by personal interpretation or previous experience, and use the results to develop a theory of conscious thought. However, his method of introspection did not remain a fundamental tool of psychological experimentation past the early 1920s, okay, especially because American psychologists considered the introspection technique as being sterile and leading to inconsistent results. Psychologists like Skinner argued that introspection was not really scientific, even if the methods used to introspect were. Skinner claims the results of introspection are subjective and cannot be verified because only observable behavior can be objectively measured. Okay, so cognitive psychology declined by the beginning of the 20th century because American psychology started to take a distinctive form with a wide range of topics under investigation. Okay, leading this expanded experimental psychology was William James, the first president of the American Psychological Association. William James is an American psychologist and philosopher who had a major influence in the development of psychology in the United States. Okay, he wrote The Principles of Psychology, which became the first psychology textbook. Okay, and he said in the book that he will follow the psychological method of introspection, which he defined as the looking into our own minds and reporting what we there discover. However, he posed the focus of structuralism, which is the analysis of the basic elements that constitute the mind. Instead, he focused on the wholeness of an event, and his belief in the connection between the mind and body led him to develop what has become known as, okay, the James Lange theory of emotion, which posits that human experience of emotion arises from physiological changes in response to external events. Okay, he also espoused the idea of pragmatism, or the truth of an idea can never be proven. Okay, in his pragmatism book, okay, William James characterizes truth in terms of usefulness and acceptance. In general, on his view, truth is found by attending to the practical consequences of ideas. Okay, he believed that we construct truth in the process of successful living in the world. Okay, so truth is in no sense absolute. Okay, beliefs are considered to be true if and only if they are useful and can be practically applied. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the decline of cognitive psychology started because of the criticisms of the behaviorists. Okay, still, despite interest in overt behavior, cognitive processes were not totally neglected. During the early 1900s, Donners and Cattell were conducting perception experiments on imageless thought using brief visual displays to examine the time required for mental operations to take place and using reaction time data as dependent measures. So here is Franciscus Donders. Okay, he was a Dutch ophthalmologist and a professor of physiology in Utrecht. He contributed to what would be later known as one of the first experiments in cognitive psychology. Okay, he did a pioneer experiment on how long it took for individuals to make a decision, and he measured this by paying attention to how long their reaction time was. Okay, he used something called a simple reaction time task, where a participant had to press a button when a light was illuminated. Okay, and another experiment is what was called a choice reaction time task. Alright, so this is James Cattell, and after visiting Germany for graduate study, he met Wilhelm Wundt and developed an interest in psychology, and he served as Wundt's assistant and went on to publish the first psychology dissertation by an American. Okay, he was the first psychology professor in the United States. He became a lecturer at the University of Cambridge, University of Pennsylvania, and later at Columbia University. In 1895, he became the president of the American Psychological Association. Now, during his time, psychology was often regarded as a lesser science and was often even viewed as a pseudoscience. Okay, however, his use of statistical methods and quantification of data helped in the development of American psychology as an experimental science. He was one of the first psychologists in America to stress the importance of quantification, ranking, and ratings. Okay, so in effect, he oriented U.S. psychology towards the use of objective experimental methods, mental testing, and application of psychology to the fields of education, business, industry, and advertising. Okay, he originated 2 professorial directories and published 5 scientific journals. In 1888, he established at the University of Philadelphia a laboratory and developed a mental measurement test for college students. Behaviorism, which became the catalyst to the decline of cognitive psychology in the 1920s, found itself being pushed out as the dominant school of thought because of the fact that their rejection of the internal workings of the brain in favor of observable, measurable behavior came to be what was necessary to understand human behavior. In essence, behaviorism failed to draw distinctions between memory and performance and failed to account for complex learning. The behaviorists came under attack from Chomsky, a linguist from MIT who developed a method of analyzing the structure of language. Chomsky argued that language was too complicated to learn and produce via behavioral principles of reinforcement and postulated the existence of a cognitive structure of an innate language acquisition device. Okay, so with seminal papers presented in 1956 in a conference on communication theory at Massachusetts Institute of Technology or MIT, cognitive psychology reemerged. Okay, the reemergence of cognitive psychology during this period is commonly referred to as cognitive revolution. Okay. So in the late 1950s, yeah, psychology or cognitive psychology began to take a new form as a new way of understanding the science of the mind. Okay. And research in verbal learning and semantic organization led to the development of testable models of memory and cognition, providing another empirical base for the study of mental processes. Okay, so those who were at the conference on communications at MIT, where Noam Chomsky Jerome Bruner, Alan Newell, Herbert Simon, and George Miller. Another influence that aided cognitive psychology's foothold was World War II. Because of the military's interest in developing and using new technology, research in vigilance, creativity, and human factors were encouraged. One outcome was the seminal report in 1954 by Tanner and Sweat on signal detection, demonstrating that cognitive processes can have a mediating effect on sensory thresholds. Another outcome of the war was that many soldiers suffered from brain injuries, and a vast amount of clinical data in perception, memory, and language were products of these victims' afflictions. So, in this period of cognitive revolution, interest turned to attention, memory, pattern recognition, images, semantic organization, language processes, thinking, and even consciousness, as well as other cognitive topics once considered outside the boundary of experimental psychology. By the 1960s, cognitive psychology became solidified as a new science with the publication of Ulrich Neisser's book, Cognitive Psychology. As I've mentioned in the beginning, cognitive psychology in the 21st century has expanded to include the many aspects of human cognition. In the first decade of the new millennium, psychology is taking on another new look, or perhaps it is simply returning to whence it came. Psychology, and in fact all of society, is embracing spirituality, accepting faith as once again a legitimate source of knowledge. And four trends that have carried into the new century are neuroscience, evolution, computers, and fragmentation. And so that is it, guys. Um, I hope you learned something from this video, although I was not able to really put in everything here. Okay, so if you want to know more, you just spend some more time in researching the topics that you're interested in.